All right, good morning, afternoon, or evening as appropriate based on your time zone, and welcome to this online launch event of the new crisis group report, Relaunching the Kosovo-Serbia Dialogue, which was published a bit earlier this week. Crisis Group, International Crisis Group, is an independent organization dedicated to saving lives through the prevention, the mitigation, and the resolution of deadly conflict. And I am the director of the Europe and Central Asia program at Crisis Group, which is the program in which the research that led up to this report was carried out. So really thrilled to have a terrific panel to discuss both what we found and wrote up and what it means. So just to briefly introduce the speakers, Marko Prelec is our consulting Balkans analyst, and he's the primary author of the report. Joining him are Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies and a crisis group trustee, also somebody with a wealth of experience with the region, and Valerie Hopkins, who is the Southeast Europe correspondent for the Financial Times and who has lived and worked extensively in the Balkans. So before we get started, just a little bit about how we're going to do this. This is going to be a conversation. It's not going to be a bunch of speeches. The folks you've got in front of you who know so much are going to talk to each other, and you're going to learn from listening to them. I'm then going to open it up to the audience for your questions and answers. So the way we're going to do that is there's a Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at this point. I'm pretty sure you've probably experienced it before. So type your questions there. Please do begin your question or end it with your name and affiliation. We are only going to take questions that have a name and affiliation. So anonymity will get your question sadly ignored. So just so you know that. Also, please be aware that this conversation is being recorded, live streamed on Facebook, and will be shared on the Crisis Group website after the event ends. So that kind of takes us through the preliminaries, and I now want to start a discussion. And what I want to start with, since this is a launch, is for us to ask Marko. Marko, if you were to, if you were given almost no time at all, 2 minutes, right? You've got a senior official from somewhere in front of you, and you're trying to say why we put out this report, why we decided it was important to put this out, and what the bottom lines are. How would you describe it?
Hey, thanks, Olga. It's almost impossible to reduce anything in the Balkans to 2 minutes, but I'll try. So we start with the observation that the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia is dead in the water. The parties send their representatives to Brussels, they talk, they go home, nothing changes. We look at what has to happen to get the dialogue moving toward its conclusion. And we also, in the other half of the report, and it really has these two aspects that are very distinct, we look at the likelihood that it will not get moving anytime soon, and we look at a number of things that need to be done while we live with the status quo of a dialogue that is somewhat moribund. So in that first half, let me mention 3 things. We look at the need for clarity about the goal of the dialogue, which has to be a positive bilateral relationship between the 2 states built on mutual recognition, and going beyond that to at least the absence of hostility. Second, we look at the need to have a coherent negotiating position in Pristina. Complicated issue, there's a government crisis there now, but more than that, the Kosovo representatives have yet to arrive at a strategy about how they want to address the dialogue. And finally, the need to bring the people in, to be more transparent about what is actually going on. And on the other side, for a variety of reasons, we think this needs to happen, but it's not going to happen in the next I don't want to give a time frame, but the near future, we need to do things to improve Kosovo's situation because it's the main victim from the impasse, the side that suffers the most. So we look at possibility of integrating Kosovo into a number of other international organizations like the Council of Europe. We look at the option to improve its bilateral relations with friendly countries and multilateral relations with sets of friendly countries. And finally, we allude to increasing the pressure on Serbia, which at times seems to indicate that it can just live with this for as long as it wants to. We think that's not entirely the case.
So that's a great overview. I want to ask Valerie what she thinks of it and what she thinks of kind of the notion that this is the right time to try to, on the one hand, accept reality, on the other hand, try to improve it at least a little bit, even if you can't fix it.
Well, thank you so much. It's a bit odd for me. I think I normally wouldn't have accepted an invitation where I'm answering questions instead of asking them. But since this is one of my favorite topics and has been for many years, I guess I couldn't resist. And it's nice to see so many familiar names here from the time that I ate, slept, and breathed only Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. And unfortunately, I think it's true to say that in those since those years, there's been a lot of action, but not a lot of progress. What do I think? I agree that it's always a good time, and I think this report is Marko has really kind of carefully distilled the current situation and how we got here, and also outlined the mostly less than a thrilling options for both sides and for the international powers who have the wherewithal to try and take them on. And I think it's a very good and important time with the change in administration in the U.S. and the prospect looming of a new administration in Germany as well. So I think it's really time, as the transatlantic alliance is being recalibrated for both sides to sort of recommit and decide what they're going to do. I think we'll have more time maybe to get into some of the policy options that were outlined in terms of sticking with the status quo, or trying to move towards some kind of border changes, which I'm more hesitant about than many others, but I think this provides a great ground for a discussion, and I think it's important to note, Marko, you in the report you mentioned one of Albin Kurti's comments that they're just going to be more patient than anyone else, like Milorad Dodik, and I think that. I think it's very hard to continue to expect that level of patience, because while many Kosovars, I think, no longer see the dialogue as a top political issue, it doesn't really figure into election campaigns. It has been the reason why many of the governments have fallen in recent years, and something that continues to stymie the political progress of the country. So I do think that without really tackling this head on, it's going to be very hard to keep moving forward. So I'll stop there. That was longer than 1 minute. Sorry about that.
No, thank you, Valerie. I think you raised some important questions. And I think it's a good way to bring in Ivan and ask whether he thinks that the report is kind of right with the fairly limited, not a lot can be done now, improve things at the margins, or if there's more that one could do, and in that case, who's won and what should they be doing?
Oh, thank you very much. And of course, first of all, it's a heroic thing these days to have a report which is not connected to COVID. So from this point of view, already a kind of a breaking the status quo. But I do believe it is quite important, because at least for me, the report is very valuable to the extent that both in 2019 and 2020, first Europeans, then the Americans were signaling that we're very close to a breakthrough moment. So if you are seeing what was happening, there was a lot of dating between Serbia and Kosovo, but not a prospect for marriage, obviously. And from this point of view, the question is, are we really close to breakthrough? What is going to come out of these efforts, first by Mogherini and then by the Trump administration? And I agree with Marko. I don't believe that in this environment, by the way, very much dominated by COVID, but also by domestic political crisis, and particularly the election situation in Kosovo, to expect that till the end of this year, you are going to have a kind of an answer to the Kosovo-Serbia relations. In my view, it's unrealistic. And when you go with something that is unrealistic, it can backfire. So managing expectations, in my view, this is fair, and this is very important, good enough. Secondly, and here also, I very much agree with Marko, is what if they're going to be a success, what we're going to call success? Because part of the problem with these negotiations is that anytime people decided to talk, we claim that it was a success. But in the case of Serbia, Kosovo, they're talking for 20 years. And they can talk for 200 years. And then basically, I do believe that just calling this success is not enough. So from this point of view, mutual recognition is really what we should be looking for. And from this point of view, if you're not going to have a mutual recognitions, you can have steps, you can have situation better or worse, but this should be the solution in a way. Basically, both Serbia and Kosovo are going to define what they want. And certainly on this, probably I'm much kind of relaxed than others. Personally, I'm ready to live with anything that the Serbian and the Kosovo societies are going to agree, but there should be consensus on both sides. It's not one person agreeing with another person on high positions. So from this point of view, I'm not going to say no to anything which is legally valid, but they should be based on consensus on the level of society and not simply basically on a pressure coming from outside that is pushing one government to another government to accept something that is going to be contested at home. And from this point of view, where I also do believe that Marko is right, is that while there is no any prospect for breakthrough in the coming months, it's really important to continue and pressing and discussing. Because this is one of those issues that are going to become a classical sleeper. You're so much used to nothing to happen that anytime you're doing it is just for tactical reasons. And we should not do it because at the end of the day, both Serbia and Kosovo, and honestly speaking, Kosovo more than Serbia, are damaged by this. And here I'm going to end up in diplomacy. They like to talk about constructive ambiguity, but there is also destructive ambiguity. And unfortunately, I do believe that the Serbia-Kosovo relations very much fit the idea of a destructive ambiguity at the moment.
Thank you, Ivan. So, you know, as you were speaking, I was thinking that the dating metaphor is interesting because it's less dating with a view to marriage. It's more negotiations through a long separation with a view to a mutually acceptable divorce settlement, right? Which is very, very, very long in the works. So Marko, tell us what the custody battle is here and how you see the two separated parties making progress towards resolving it.
I think it operates on two almost totally separate levels. I mean, there's the debate about what is really going to happen, which is not a debate about a lot of, there's not a lot of disagreement. There's some disagreement that it's real and actually quite bitter, but not, you know, not that much. And then there's a debate which is somewhat theatrical and for public consumption. So, you know, when Serbian political actors say we're not going to recognize Kosovo for, you know, in my lifetime, for 100 years, for 500 years, whatever, that does not mean that they really believe that at some point in the foreseeable future, Kosovo will really be reintegrated, right? And with a bit less confidence, I can say that when Kosovar politicians say, you know, either we're not willing to make any compromises at all, and we're simply going to wait for Serbia to apologize, pay reparations, and then we'll shake their hand, that they really mean that literally. But that is still destructive. Okay, it's still destructive because people listen to that, they hear that, and they draw certain conclusions from it, and they are not ready, therefore, to see their governments acting in a way that leads them toward any kind of meaningful compromise. So the custody dispute, which is the real dispute, is pretty small, and it relates to basically how the minorities, the ethnic minorities in both countries are governed. What happens with them? You know, there's an Albanian minority in Serbia. They need to be addressed just for fairness, but the real issue is the Serbian minority in Kosovo, which lives in a couple of different places in a few distinct situations. There are some that are very compact next to Serbia, others who are more scattered and more isolated. So what is going to happen with them? How are those parts of Kosovo going to be governed? Are they even going to stay in Kosovo? That gets into the whole question of where the border lies. But these are, you know, we're talking about small parts of the country populated by relatively few people. And about all the rest, there's very close to agreement, which cannot be admitted. That's my view. So and because we can't admit it, we have this theatrical kind of presentation where we sing arias about, you know, territorial integrity and our history and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Valerie, do you agree with that? That it's a lot of posturing and everyone knows what it needs, you know, where it really needs to come out, but nobody's able to go there?
I mean, I think there's always certainly quite a lot of posturing. I think that, and I think that you can see very clearly that when there's either a domestic pressure or when you get close to an agreement, it's like one of these, I don't know, what are they called, toxic relationships or something, right? You know, where there's a mismatch between since we're doing all these dating analogies, between the pursuer and the pursued, and I think it's definitely clear that in times where things are going well, going forward, getting implemented, there can be a dramatic incident that comes in and explodes the relations and puts the brakes on negotiations for a while, gives everybody, you know, buys some time, they need to cool off, and, you know, like the train that came in 2017, you know, from Russia, which everybody could have seen, you know, for 2 weeks as a looming catastrophe. But the other point that I wanted to make, actually, to your first question about why this is which is an interesting and good time to have this report, is that we could be looking at, by the middle of the year, a totally new teams on both sides doing negotiations. You know, if Vendosia does win the elections, as it looks that it will, after being forced out of power in a pandemic by a Western government, my own home country's government, in the hopes of having a deal, that, you know, they may take a very different approach and may, if the polling is to be believed, actually have a considerable amount of the population behind them, which is something that successive governments in Kosovo have not had any popular legitimacy. And in Serbia as well, you know, there'll be the same people at the top and much more continuity from the Serbian negotiating side than there has been from Kosovo side, but there will still be a new team, new faces, new personalities, which I think is a new chance to build relationships. I mean, when I would speak to the people who went to Brussels for negotiations or in Washington, you know, they do all get along very well. Most of them still speak the same language, Serbian. They make jokes with one another. The amount of humor that I've heard from the negotiating table is actually quite high. The amount of frustration and anger too is also quite high. But I think that also speaks to the fact that what happens behind closed doors is very different from what's generated for public consumption and then allowed to be exaggerated, quite possibly by horrible media, especially in Serbia. But I think maybe, you know, if both sides do approach this in good faith, it's possible that there can be a new impetus. And I think, you know, it should not be ignored as well that that it took more than a year and a half, I think, for the tariff against Serbian goods to be lifted, but it was done eventually by Vindosija, and I think in the end they were the only party that kind of had the public legitimacy to do that, because it's precisely not necessarily what they want to do. Now I guess I'm getting too much into the weeds, so I will maybe come back to you for another question, or for someone else to.
No, I mean, I think this is good meaty material, not weeds. It's but I do want to kind of raise the aperture a little bit and ask Yvonne. We have, this last year with all of this activity from the United States and from Brussels, which came to naught, and Valerie has made the case, and Marko has made the case, that in the region people understand the situation pretty well. At least the leadership does. The population maybe less so. These new and the old government officials in Europe, in the United States, who get engaged time and again, what do they understand? And I think more interestingly, what do they not understand each time they kind of dive in? Is there, is there a gap? Are they making assumptions that are out of date or just uninformed? Or do they understand and they're just using this politically, which is something that you and others have also already raised?
Listen, these days it's not clear who understands what anyway. So it's not only on Kosovo-Serbia issue, but there were two different trends that were pushing behind the negotiations. One was very much driven by some of the local leaders who wanted to make a message that we're important enough and we can ready and negotiate between ourselves. And even if it is a divorce, we don't need the divorce lawyers. And this was very much about getting asserting the role of the national political leaders in a moment in which, of course, the Western Balkans are not at the top of the political agenda of anybody, for good reasons. You can see how many crises here and there. In the United States, of course, this administration is much more interested in the Western Balkans, also for biographical reasons. Many of the people who are now in power, they have been in the Balkans, but this also could be a problem because they remember the Balkans from the time when they have been there. And the region has changed a lot. And as a result of it, basically trying to see that the Western Balkans is not simply the post-conflict situation, that there is a very important demographic, economic changes. This is critically important. You should see it what it is and not what it was. On the European side, of course, also there was an issue because Europeans were highly frustrated with the fact that they believe that they're in the driving seat and they can deliver, and probably this is one of the few places you can deliver, and nothing much was happening. So on paper, you have a lot of leverage over all the players. And at the end of the day, nothing is happening. So I'm afraid that on one level, you have much more nostalgic view, and on the way, much more frustration. And this is bad to understand what is going on. There is a major generational change, for example, in places like Kosovo. A lot of young people, for them, this is a different place. There is a different place also in Serbia. Also, the relations between the external powers to the conflict has changed dramatically. This day, of course, United States and the European Union are going to be much more coordinated than during the last American administration, but it's different Turkey comparing with the 10 or 15 years ago. It's different Russia comparing with 10 or 15 years ago. So I do believe that the major risk is, and this is why I found the report quite important, is we start with the idea that, okay, they're not going to be a breakthrough, but also the assumption is that nothing really wrong can go, and it happened. Unfortunately, this was the assumptions behind the Armenian Azeri Nagorno-Karabakh story. So the fact that certain conflict is frozen does not mean that it cannot be warmed up. And it's not about climate change. So I do believe that the report is making a very important point. And the point is that, listen, this unresolved conflict is there, and it can be used by different political forces, by different external and internal actors at some point to make a point. And this I found really worrying. And from this point of view, looking at Nagorno-Karabakh and trying to see something that was sleeping for such a long time and how kind of a violently woke up should be something that both Europeans, Americans, and for sure people in the region should keep into account. And this is why I do believe that probably this is what we are not understanding. We assume that nothing really positive and constructive can happen on a short term, but we also relax that nothing really bad can happen. And while I agree with the report that we cannot expect a positive breakthrough in the next months, the things always can go wrong much easier than we expect.
That's cheerful. I want to build on that. I mean, I've also been thinking a lot about Karabakh, and one of the things that strikes me as a big difference is that over the 30 years of failure to resolve the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the societies have gotten further and further and further apart. There isn't that joking, there isn't that mutual understanding. There's just been a complete separation of the two societies. It's not quite the same with Kosovo and Serbia, but there is, as all the panelists have alluded to, there is a popular belief that the rhetoric is more than just the rhetoric, that these aren't just negotiating positions, these are things that are attainable. So I wanted to ask Marko what it takes to, in the words of South Caucasus leaders, right, before they started the war, they kept talking about the need to prepare the populations for peace, which obviously did not happen. The populations instead continue to be prepared for war. How do you prepare these populations for peace?
Well, you need to, that's a great question. You need to get them thinking about what the real choices are facing their society. And you know, in other conflicts, I think people understand that. They understand the different options. I mean, you know, I'm not an expert on things like, you know, the Middle East, but I would like to think that if you go and you have discussions with, you know, reasonably well-educated people in the Arab-Israeli conflict, they could explain the different policy options that are out there, one state, two state, you know, et cetera. Those things are all up in the air, even if a particular person, you know, dislikes one or another of them. That does not really happen in my experience outside of a very select company in Kosovo and Serbia. So you need to at least start doing what Serbia's President Vučić has been doing, which is alluding in this extremely vague way to, you know, the need to make compromises and we're not necessarily going to get everything. You know, that is like step one. They need to go many steps beyond that and start saying, okay, well, you know, we could do this, we could do that. Here's what we can get. Here's what we can give up. Kosovo has not even, the Kosovar leaders have not even taken that step. Okay, there was during the dating to which you alluded, Hashim Taci, then President Taci, started, you know, tiptoeing toward that. He's of course now out of commission for other reasons, being on trial for war crimes in The Hague. But you need to start explaining to people, you know, if we are to come to terms with our neighbor, here are the different kinds of relationships that are conceivable. And also, and this is maybe just as important as everything I've just said, also just be frank with them about the realistic possibility that we will continue living the way we're living now, you know, I don't want to say forever, but for the rest of, you know, your lifetimes. That's also a choice. You know, people sometimes think, you know, it's just going to get better. We don't like any of these options that are being offered. They're all kind of unpleasant. They make us nervous. You know, something better will come along if we just wait. And Valerie mentioned the quote that attributed to Alvin Kurti, that would just be patient. Being patient makes sense if you think time is on your side, but you know, if time is working against you, it's the wrong strategy. So you need to just be open with people about the possibility that in 2030, we'll be having this same conversation accept that some of the things that you now dislike, some of the options that you now dislike will no longer even be on the table, and you'll be looking at even worse options. Okay, that is also possible. In fact, that is likely, more likely than not. So this is the kind of discussion, and if you're listening to me and thinking, gee, I would hate to be a leader saying that, you know, I would indeed hate to be a leader saying that to my people too, which explains why they don't do it, but they have to find a way. They have to find a way, and they have spin doctors and high-priced consultants who can explain how to give that message in a slightly sweeter, easier to swallow version than I've just done.
Valerie, from all of your years watching this part of the world, what do you think are the odds that they can sweeten this particular pill?
Well, I mean, I think this year is kind of a missed opportunity. I think it would have been very interesting to see what could have happened, you know, in a pandemic year where Vetvendosia came to power for the first time, you know, warts and all, focused on the pandemic, but maybe they wouldn't have been able to do as good of a job as they did the first few months. Maybe they wouldn't have been able to continue that all year. But there is a parallel world where they may have built up a lot of trust. You know, you have quite nationalist credentials of a politician, and you have a negotiating partner on the other side in President Vučić, who no longer has any excuse for why he can't make a deal. I mean, he has a supermajority in his parliament. He, you know, we could have been in a scenario where time was running out for him, because he really could not say anymore to European interlocutors, well, like, they won't let me do this, or well, I can't, or well, I wouldn't be able to deliver a majority in a constitutional referendum, you know, which is required for Serbia to amend its constitution to remove mention of Kosovo in it. And instead, of course, he can continue to say, well, I'm ready to make a deal, I'm here to negotiate. But look, you know, it's very disorganized down there. I don't have anyone, you know, with enough legitimacy to make a deal with. That being said, there are definitely a lot of things that could be happening, I think, in Serbia to this end that are not, which are, you know, improved coverage, not continuing to lie to people, to the public, making some statements about the type of hate speech against Albanians that appears so regularly in the media, and kind of pursuing at home the same kind of face that Vučić tries to show abroad, which is that we want to have good neighborly relations. You know, I mean, President Vučić has won a lot of credit for trying to be a regional leader in creating a mini Schengen zone. But when you look at the polls done, for instance, by students at the University of Belgrade, you know, I think 60% of Serbs that they polled wouldn't want to have an Albanian as a neighbor. Almost 90 wouldn't want their child to marry one. You wouldn't want them to be a teacher, etc. And I think that the public discourse that's modeled by politicians and by those who have quite a lot of tremendous access to mass media is really important. And I think that continues to sting and frustrate many people in Kosovo. And I think, you know, there's certainly a lot of resentment in the Kosovo public sphere. There's also certainly a lot of strong rhetoric, you know, and continued use of the Vetvendosia slogan, no negotiation, self-determination. But I think that, you know, Marko very rightly pointed out in the report that very little is being done to prepare anyone for a deal. And I think the public climate is worse now, for instance, in Serbia, as far as hate speech is concerned, than it was 10 years ago. And that's very concerning.
Thank you. We are well on our way, and I want to make sure we get questions from the audience into this discussion. So I'm going to start bringing those in. The first one, and having asked you for your names and affiliations, please do forgive me if I in any way butcher the pronunciation. You are free to butcher the pronunciation of my name whenever it comes up in your own professional career. So I'm going to start with Jasmina Kuzmanovic from Bloomberg, who asks, I think, all of the panelists what their expectations are for Kosovo-Serbia dynamics with the Biden administration and for the US cooperation with Germany under Marko while she's still in place. And I'd follow that up with after that. I mean, this has come up, but I'd like to go into a little more detail. And I think I'll start with Yvonne for this one, and then we'll kind of go around.
Thank you very much. Let's start with Germany, not because it is easier, but first of all, we should try to see how the post-Merkel Germany looks like. There are going to be an elections, and we don't know even how the government is going to look like. But there is one thing that is going to change. First, I do believe now Germany is facing pressure on so many fronts, starting with the European Union, relations with China, relations with the United States, that to believe that the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue is going to be on the top of the German agenda is slightly unrealistic. And secondly, while for the Chancellor Merkel, it was quite important because over the years, she has developed a relationship with the leaders in the region. They trusted her, she trusted them to a certain extent. For nevertheless, who is going to be the next German leader, he is not going, at least in the beginning, to have this relationship. So to a great extent, Germany's presence in the region, Germany's leverage was Merkel's leverage. And there's going to be some time before, nevertheless, who is the next German leader is going to have this type of a trust relationship. And for me, this is important because to a great extent, anybody who wants to do something about the Western Balkans should try to make it a personal issue. Seeing so many different problems in the world, it's not going to be easy otherwise to achieve anything. And the second thing is that I do believe here both for different reasons, Serbia and Kosovo and their leaders can read some changes in the international relations wrongly. On the Kosovo side, most of the Kosovo leaders basically assumed the support of the international community, of the Western countries, of the United States as something given, not realizing how much we have this realist shift based on the fact that when people discuss Western Balkans, there are linkages to other issues too. Relations with Russia, relations with Turkey, general relations between US and the European Union. So this is not like it was in the beginning of the century. On the Serbian side, I do believe that what President Vučić does not realize is that if you're an international actor and you're looking at the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, you see Vučić is so strong that he can deliver anything that he wants. And Kosovo looks in a certain way so contested and dysfunctional that there is no much need to press them on anything because basically you're not going to achieve much. So Kosovo is very much in a way benefiting from their weakness, and Vučić is going to pay the price of looking basically so powerful because anything that he's not doing, basically the international community says he's not doing because he does not want to do it. And in my view, this kind of asymmetry is also going to be particularly important because one of the interesting story about the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue that we didn't talk about is that for both Kosovo leadership and for the Serb leadership, being part of this dialogue is the way to focus the attention on the problems of their countries. Because of the Kosovo-Serbian dialogue, Kosovo president or prime minister, Serbian president can call world leaders. In a normal situation, people without the problems that they have is not going to be so easy to reach neither the chancellor nor somebody on a high position on the American side. So they had the privilege over these years to have an access to a top international decision makers. And they're using this. I do believe this is one of the reasons why nobody is going to be interested to put an end to the dialogue. The moment when they're not negotiating to each other, they don't have much reasons their calls to be taken seriously by the capitals outside of the region. And this dynamics, at least in my view, is going to be quite important.
Thank you, Ivan. We actually have a lot of questions. So I think I'm going to kind of fire a question at a panelist, and then if other panelists want to integrate answers to other questions into their responses, they can do that as we go. So the next question is from Deanna Sarich of CSIS, and it's addressed to Valerie. And it's about the impact on the self-determination party, even if they win the upcoming election, if Kurti is not allowed on the ticket. Valerie, what do you think?
Well, and I never put in the caveat, of course, that these are only my views and I'm not, expressing any opinion of my employer. But my sense is from people that I talk to every day in Kosovo is that frustration will grow among people, and I think it will only increase their support. I mean, when Vettvendosje won by a hair the elections on October 6th in what was the 2019, in the pre-pandemic era, they had 30%, something like 33%. They had 1 percentage point above LDK. Now they're polling between 50 and 60. And I think the frustration over the way that the government was toppled and what will be perceived frustration considering that Kurti will not be allowed to run, will help their support. But it's also possible, it seems to be uncharted legal territory, whether or not Kurti will still be allowed to be the prime minister. In Kosovo, you don't have to be an elected member of parliament in order to be elected prime minister. So it's still possible that technically that he could become the prime minister, but I presume if that happened, it would then go to the constitutional court and we would again have another, months and months of a waiting game. And of course, the parliament needs to elect the president, so that could also be very complicated. But they could elect the president even while the prime ministerial post is in the constitutional court. But it's a real shame and a pity to again be in a situation of this kind of uncertainty, because there's a global pandemic on. Kosovo is not doing that well. They still haven't sorted out precisely how they're going to get vaccines. And I think, we haven't talked that much about the pandemic, but I think, cooperation on facilitating vaccinations and helping could have been a big gesture of goodwill. Serbia has been doing incredibly well in procuring vaccines, both from Pfizer, also from Sinopharm, also from Sputnik. And there are so many legal issues related to that that we're watching play out these days. The Kosovo authorities raided a clinic in a mixed but predominantly Serb town in the south of Kosovo, Trustee, because they thought that the Chinese vaccine had been illegally imported. What are the rights of citizens, of people who hold Serbian citizenship, who can technically access Serbian healthcare in the territory of Kosovo? And I think, if there had been a lot of goodwill presented, this is something that could have been something that brought the parties together and created a big step of goodwill. And I think that's a real missed opportunity.
Thank you, Valerie. The next question is from Kurt Bassiner. Hi, Kurt. And I'm going to condense it a little bit. He is asking about the impact of possible ways forward on recognition for democratic development in both Serbia and Kosovo. So start with Marko, and then if Valerie and Yvonne want to weigh in, they can do that.
Yeah, it's a great question and an interesting situation. In Kosovo, despite being the youngest country, literally and metaphorically, in the Western Balkans, and a country with all kinds of institutional problems with its democracy, nonetheless has a vibrant democracy. Okay, so voters have a choice, and governments, parties win and lose power, right? And Valerie alluded, the opinion polls are all suggesting that there could be a big win for Vettvendosje. That would be a real novelty for Kosovo to have them in a stable government. So you've kind of got democratization. At least you've got something to work with in Kosovo. Serbia is in a very weird position now. It is hard to think of a time when it has been less less democratic, I guess. I mean, there are still elections, and I'd like to point to one irony that is sometimes forgotten. Vučić and his party came into power on a domestic platform, but they also came into power with fairly good relations with European leaders, despite their nationalist coattails or baggage, because they were seen, because they promised to be more cooperative with respect to Kosovo, and they were more cooperative than the previous government. And we have seen how high the price tag for that is in the systematic dismantling of civil society, the free press, and democratic institutions in Serbia. So, and yet, you know, and there's always another side, and yet we do have the situation where now it is easier for Belgrade to make concessions than it would otherwise have been. It's easier for Belgrade than it is for Kosovo, for the reason that if Vučić does something that is, that some could read as, you know, nationally humiliating, he can weather that. Whereas any government, any party that is part of a governing coalition in Kosovo knows that whatever it is they put forward, whatever concession they put on the table in the dialogue, is liable to be, you know, twisted, used out of context. They're going to be hammered with it on social media by their rivals, even if those rivals supported that very same position up until yesterday. So it's just much harder to do this kind of thing where you have a vibrant democracy. That may not be a satisfactory answer. It's not a satisfactory situation. At least that's the way I see it.
I want to see if Ivan or Valerie want to jump in on this, and if not, we'll go on to other questions of which we have a wealth. Either of you have anything to add? Okay. Oh.
Just one sentence, which is but this is quite important. If you see basically the argument on which Vučić tried to justify his monopoly on power, more and more it's becoming the economic argument. We are delivering on the economy, and even on the story of the COVID-19, if you see the percent of the population being vaccinated, Serbia is one of the leaders of the world. From this point of view, one of the kind of temptations on the Kosovo side is to play the political competition, because I very much agree, in Kosovo you have a vibrant political competition. The government can lose elections, which is not becoming so easily in many of the Balkan countries these days. Some of the leaders don't know how to do it anymore. But the problem is that at the same time, this should not be at the cost of going on symbolic politics and trying to marginalize the economic issues. Because at some point you need political competitions that delivering to the people. Democracy cannot simply be that you're changing governments. The government should give you something. And from this point of view, the discussion about the Serbia-Kosovo relations is very much about the relations between the symbolic and between the economic benefits. Kosovo can really benefit a lot if they're going to be a solution. And to be honest, Serbia can benefit a lot if they're going to be a solution of this problem. So the more both society try to think in economic terms, in a way, it's going to be easier to go for this compromise that and mutual recognitions we're talking about.
Thank you. The next question is from Stephen Whitaker, who is wondering if the panelists could elaborate on the issue of so-called land swaps, and more specifically, which Valerie had also raised in passing a little bit earlier in our discussion, and specifically whether you buy into the idea that facilitating such a scenario could destabilize neighboring countries such as Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm going to start with Marko again on this one because it's his report and I know he has views. So, Marko.
Yeah. Land swaps. I've actually changed my view on this over the years. I used to think that it was a good idea, a positive thing, that it was something that just should be done. And the reason I thought that was because the areas where that were in question, so northern Kosovo, Preševo Valley, from what I knew from being there, I've actually never visited Preševo, but I have very close friends who are from there and who spent a lot of time there. They, to some extent, already live as though they had been swapped, and overwhelmingly would prefer to be swapped. So I thought, you know, we should just do what the people want. And my view now is that that is still true, but it is risky. There are a lot of risks. So what I've come down to is exactly what it says in the report. This is an option that is far from ideal. And I would not go any further than saying, if whoever's in charge in Belgrade and whoever's in charge in Pristina think that they can make it work. And I absolutely agree with Ivan's caveat that this has to go beyond the leadership. You know, Serbia, it's already clear that it's got to be handled in a referendum. You know, Kosovo leaders may want to have a referendum too, for whatever it is they finally agree on. It's got to have, you know, deep support, wide and deep support. And we just shouldn't, I think it's a distraction. This whole debate of can it be on the agenda or not, I think is a distraction. When you have parties who are so far apart from each other, as Belgrade and Pristina are, telling them that they need to be even further apart by not being able to discuss certain things that they might want to discuss and actually have discussed in the past, I think is a mistake. That's about as far as I'm willing to go. As far as whether it can destabilize countries, I don't really see that happening in Bosnia for reasons that would take us, I think, too long to go into. But, you know, Bosnia has been destabilized for a long time, okay? You have a secessionist party in power in Republika Srpska. They have made absolutely no secret of their, you know, not only their desire, but even their plan eventually to secede. So this is not a new thing. And it is not connected to Kosovo in their mind or in anyone else's mind. The place I'm more concerned about really is North Macedonia. But I think that can be handled. And it, you know, if the one thing I would say to leaders of Serbia and Kosovo is, you should also, this is also to some extent on you. It will be, if you do choose to go that route, you need to take steps to talk to your whoever you're close to in the neighboring countries, and ensure that you do this without harming them.
Thanks, Marko. Valerie, you had, okay, Ivan wants to jump in, but I think Valerie does also. So Valerie first and then Ivan.
Thanks. Well, I'll try and be brief. Marko covered a lot of the points. I think one of the first thing is, of course, that there was so much talk about land swap, but nobody knew precisely what it would entail. Nobody ever saw it. I mean, there were, of course, there's discussion and a hush hush among the think tank world about precisely what's on the table and how much territory and what are the places. But you know, the public was never given some real idea of what it could be. You know, I mean, Kosovo, all of the countries have had to demarcate their borders. And I think, you know, a couple of kilometers here and there with access to resources or shared access to resources, you know, makes a big difference in terms of whether people would support it or not. I will say that, you know, the border demarcation with Montenegro took 2 years and several, at least one government fell because of that, which, you know, you would imagine that, I don't know, was it 2,000 hectares of land, a very mountainous, rocky land, which I would argue probably has a lot less meaning for many Kosovo Albanians and Serbs than a swap of territory. The other thing, and the other main reason why at that time I think there was no legitimacy or very little legitimacy for that idea in Kosovo was because it was being seen as something that the president Thatcher was willing to agree to in order to save himself from indictment, an indictment which now has come, and that a Trump administration was doing it for their own short-term goals in a way that wasn't really thought out, which, you know, and we saw I think we've all seen the way that President or ex-President Trump tried to sell the White House deal that he ended up getting. In terms of destabilizing other countries, I mean, I agree with you, Marko, that North Macedonia would be a big threat, and you know, North Macedonia's president, Stevo Pendarovski, even after the country joined NATO, was very, very vocal about his fear for the effects that a land swap would have on North Macedonia. And I think there are many people in Bosnia as well. And I think, I mean, I also think that many people were worried about the message that it sends in the 21st century, that people can't live together. Because as we said earlier in this call, many people find ways of getting along together. In North Mitrovica, they often go to the same stores. You know, there's one big mega mall where the things are cheaper. People go there, people have contact, they still have contact with their old neighbors and stuff. And so it sends a pretty dispiriting message in the 21st century that the only way to have peace is to segregate people. But that being said, I think it's very hard to just to 100% dismiss the concept without, you know, knowing more concretely what would be on the table. And I do, Marko very astutely makes the point that both sides need to feel that they've gotten something. So, which I can understand why most Kosovars find that insulting and frustrating, but I guess it's still a fact. Ivan, go ahead, take it away.
I do believe Marko made one very important distinction, because the question about the land swap became the problem of the role of the international community. I don't see the role of the international community imposing land swaps to anybody. On the other side, I don't see the role of the international community telling the Serbs and the Kosovars, you cannot do this, because then you are basically owning this. I'm very kind of, I don't see this as a realistic solution, particularly in this moment. I never believed this. This is why I have never been very much interested in what exactly it means. But this is very important to tell to the negotiators on both sides. Listen, guys, you have all the options you can agree on, which is legal. We are not going to stop you because of Bosnia for one very simple reason. The lack of a land swap is not going to stabilize Bosnia. I don't know, is it going to destabilize it, but obviously the problem of Bosnia very much in Bosnia than is what is happening in the region. And the international community should try to make basically the politicians responsible for what they decide. Because all the time is what kind of a message is coming from the international. Come with go say, oh, I'm not doing this because you're not allowing me to do this, or I'm not doing this because you're not allowing to do this.
Okay, Ivan,
and this is the status quo, which I don't believe the internet community.
Okay, we've got a bit of a in and out on Ivan, but I think we got the gist, and I know Marko wants to jump in. So I'm going to let him do that. We're running out of time, so I'm going to let Marko respond quickly, then we'll do one more question, and I am going to have to close this up.
Just wanted to add one thing on that exact topic of the risks. It's worth remembering that, or noting that the status quo also has risks for the neighboring states. We're now in an election campaign in Kosovo, so we should probably take statements like this with a grain of salt, but one of the leaders has called for a referendum on unification with Albania. That would, in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of people, be even more destabilizing for Macedonia if it were to happen. Totally unrealistic, but it's not. You always have to look at the costs, not only of an action, but also of refraining to take that action, because it's not cost-free.
Thank you. Last question, which I think is a really good one, from Dimmu Shasha, who's the Executive Director of the European Policy Institute of Kosovo. who points out that since the dialogue began in 2011, despite the lack of a big breakthrough, there have been positive steps: freedom of movement, liaison offices, Kosovo's energy independence, the two countries meet in regional fora. So what the question is that if we assume the realistic scenario of recognition by Serbia of Kosovo independence by, let's say, 2025, what would be the plan B success? And let Marko respond first, and then let Ivan and Valerie jump in on kind of, what's the plan B success? What does it look like? And then I think we are going to have to close up. So Marko, you first.
Sure. I don't see, and I think it's actually an interesting question to which I don't have a complete answer. Okay, I'll give you my answer, which is that there's not a lot of room left to make progress without a comprehensive agreement with Serbia, but there is some room. So we should do that. And basically, I think it's on the international legal side. So Kosovo can apply for and should be able to get into the Council of Europe, and that would extend the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, which is, an important part of European law now. I think it would also be interesting. Kosovo has decided not to do this in the past, but it would be interesting to seek non-member observer status in the General Assembly of the UN, because that carries, it's kind of like a I am a state card. You're a non-member state. And therefore, with that affirmation, you can do things like bring cases, at least under some circumstances, in the International Court of Justice. You can potentially accede to the International Criminal Court. So these are things that would be, to at least some extent, stabilizing. And beyond that, I think it's just important to work on national consolidation. Okay, consolidating the educational system, building the economy, building up healthcare, improving governance. These kinds of things are likely to be high on the agenda of Vetrandosia government. The long term, so past 2025, best case scenario there is shooting for a status something like Taiwan, where, yeah, sure, you're excluded from the UN and all kinds of other international forums, but everyone admits that you're real and you're rich, and you're a factor to be a force to be reckoned with. It would take Kosovo, quite a while. There's a lot of work to be done to get up to that level, if it is even possible. But I would work on that kind of thing. Work on the domestic side.
Thank you, Ivan.
Just one side. Probably both sides are going to like China-Taiwan comparison better than West Germany is Germany on the level of normalization. So probably this is the plan B.
Thank you. Valerie.
I think Marko said a lot of it, but I think, if there's a really public campaign maybe this is a pure idealism, but a public campaign in both countries to actively improve the lives of minorities in both of the countries. I think, something that I saw from my reporting on the extent to which the agreements had been implemented, what frustrated people most was like the difficulties posed to their going about their daily lives. People who didn't have a Kosovo driver's license and couldn't legally drive, 10 kilometers away from down south from their house. There's still problems, I think, in adapting a driver's license. If you learn to drive in North Kosovo, since it was declared independent, you cannot, that's considered still in a legal institution, and you can't just transfer it to the Kosovo institution. But what we've seen is, especially when it concerns business, finance, trade, and customs, it's possible when there's really an interest for both sides to find a way to work around this. So, prioritizing the needs of citizens to live a normal life, to have their diplomas recognized, which was something that was agreed in 2011 and is still not implemented. On a bigger scale, I think we lost a lot of momentum in the relationships in the last few years with a very active de-recognition campaign by Serbia. I think even, you know, one thing that wasn't mentioned in the report, but maybe it wasn't, I don't know if it was ever proven, but, you know, even there was media reports about payments to certain countries in Africa for derecognizing. And I think that sends the wrong message. I think that it's not equal to pursue recognition and pursue it on one side and to pursue derecognition on another side, because I think that at a certain point, until let's say 2015, there was a realization in Belgrade that Kosovo was lost, and okay, slowly we'll sort of quietly let them continue to make progress on the international stage without publicly condemning that, or with condemning it, but, you know, allowing it as long as they don't acknowledge independence. And I think that is now something that really changed. But I think that also Ivan's point really about the economies and improving economic growth, I think is something that after this pandemic year is going to be more important than ever, and a time in which probably a lot of populations as well are returning home from Western Europe. There will be maybe more jobless people, more people who are frustrated, who've been stuck in the country, who can't travel. And I will make again a final plea for a more constructive approach to vaccines. I mean, if Serbia is fifth in the world, maybe it would be interesting to see a way, you know, it would be very interesting, you know, because maybe they've done it and the Kosovo, didn't want to accept it, but they can't tell that to their people. But it would create a very interesting dynamic, I think. So, thank you.
Thank you all. Really terrific conversation, and really appreciate all three of our panelists, Marko, Valerie, and Ivan, for taking part and making this dynamic. Thank you so much to everybody. We did not get to all of the many excellent questions, just demonstrating how much more there is to say. This has been a public event, so all fully on the record. The recording is going to be available on the events page of the Crisis Group website, www.crisisgroup.org/event-recordings, as well as our YouTube channel shortly after we turn this off. But again, just thank you so much for taking part. And again, this has been the launch of our report, How to Relaunch the Kosovo-Serbia Dialogue. If you have not read it, I encourage you to do so. We're quite pleased with how it's turned out. Thank you so much, and goodbye.